The news is full of stories about the new COVID-19 vaccines, and of course the internet is overloaded with information, not all of which is factual. So this is a discussion of the vaccines, the science, and what we might expect moving forward. Of course, the hope is that the vaccines will help bring the pandemic to an end, allowing us to return to some semblance of normal life. The problem is, vaccines only work if people take them. I am hopeful that the more people understand how and why the vaccines were developed so quickly, the more people will be willing to accept them. COVID-19 vaccines are truly a remarkable scientific development, and the fact that the vaccines have proven so effective in clinical trials is reason for us all to be hopeful. The rapid development of the vaccines has led a lot of people to feel concerned about their safety. I will discuss some commonly expressed fears and will hopefully allay some of those fears in the next few slides. There's a lot of talk about the speed with which this vaccine has been developed. And it's true, under normal circumstances, it does take years for vaccines to be developed. However, things are different in a pandemic, and there are a lot of reasons for that. First of all, in a vaccine trial, those who have received the vaccine must go out and possibly be exposed to a virus in order to find out if the vaccine prevents illness from the virus exposure. So in ordinary times, when a virus is circulating at typical rates, it might take a while for a person to potentially be exposed. But in a pandemic in which the virus is being transmitted rapidly, it really doesn't take long for test subjects to have potential exposures. So that's one reason. Additionally, as we all know, the pandemic has really brought the world to a standstill, and there's significant investment of time, resources into vaccine development. So when scientists all around the world are devoting all of their time to making a vaccine, when governments, private investors, philanthropists are all pouring money into vaccine development, it can be done much more quickly. Everyone wants the pandemic to end, and everyone knows that a vaccine is a powerful tool in a fight toward that shared goal. So I think the rapid vaccine development is really a testament to what can be done when people work together and have a shared goal. Another note about the relative speed of the COVID-19 vaccine development. It's true that scientists have been working on an HIV vaccine for decades, and there are many reasons that there's not yet an HIV vaccine in spite of those years of work. But the biggest reason is that HIV is a unique type of virus which replicates and mutates very quickly, which makes it a very challenging vaccine target. Incidentally, the coronavirus, like all viruses, also mutates. Fortunately, the mutations that have been identified to date do not seem to reduce the protection offered by the vaccines that are being developed. There are also often questions about why there's no vaccine for the common cold. And that's really because the common cold is actually caused by hundreds of different viruses. So because of that, and because the illness produced by those viruses is mild, there really isn't a lot of incentive to spend the time and money needed to develop a common cold vaccine. The most common questions and fears I hear are related to the fact that the two earliest COVID-19 vaccines are mRNA vaccines. Because mRNA vaccines are relatively new, that can feel a little scary. So we'll talk about what mRNA is and how the mRNA vaccines work. mRNA is a signal that our cells make. It serves as a template for how to make proteins. An mRNA vaccine is a synthetic portion of mRNA which goes to our cells and tells them, in this case, to make a replica of the spike protein from the coronavirus. Once the spike protein is made, our immune system makes antibodies to it. Even after the mRNA and the spike proteins are broken down by enzymes in our bodies, the antibodies remain to protect us should we be exposed to the actual virus. It might sound scary or weird to think that the vaccine is telling our cells to do something and making our cells do something. But when one considers that that's what viruses do, they use our cells to replicate themselves, and usually to replicate their whole selves. To have our cells making just a portion of the virus doesn't sound so unusual or so alarming. It's also worth noting that mRNA technology has been utilized in medicine for years, but it hasn't been a feasible option as a vaccine because mRNA actually degrades very quickly. That's why the mRNA vaccines have to be kept at such low temperatures. So while it might not have been worth the effort to ship vaccines in dry ice at super low temperatures during ordinary times, if it has a chance to end a pandemic, then, bring on the dry ice. Also, since this technology has already been in use, once the COVID-19 gene sequence was published back in January, it really had to just be kind of plugged into the existing technology, which is another reason why this mRNA vaccine could be developed so quickly. There are fears that mRNA from the vaccines will alter our DNA, but that's actually not how mRNA works, except in the case of retroviral mRNA, but the coronavirus is not a retrovirus. Our own mRNA is made by DNA, which is inside of the nucleus or control center of our cells. Once our mRNA is made, it goes out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm, which is the part of the cell that's outside of the nucleus, and there it serves as a template for protein production. The mRNA from the vaccines is able to enter our cells, but it cannot enter the nucleus. Even if it could enter the nucleus, it wouldn't affect our DNA because, again, that's not what mRNA does. There's an official sounding theory that the antibodies produced by the vaccine can cause infertility by attacking a protein in our bodies that facilitates placental development. This is a complex myth, so it requires a bit of a complex explanation. There does happen to be a tiny portion of the spike protein that looks like a tiny portion of the syncytin 1 protein, which is the one that we're talking about that aids in placental development. This is the source of the myth, this shared tiny portion. So people are saying because of this shared portion of protein, the antibodies to the spike protein could also attack this protein, which is important for the early stages of pregnancy. There are several reasons why this theory is implausible. First, antibodies only recognize proteins of a certain size as foreign agents, and this tiny shared portion is not big enough to be recognized by an antibody. Secondly, when one considers that each of these proteins, the spike protein and the syncytin 1 protein, contain hundreds of amino acids, and that the shared portion only has about 3 amino acids, the similarity is obviously very minimal. It would be like mistaking one person for another because they both have a freckle on their left cheek, even though they share no other facial features. Finally, this theory is implausible because the antibodies produced in response to the vaccine are the same as antibodies produced in response to a COVID infection. And the COVID pandemic has not resulted in a sudden spike in infertility, so there would be no reason to expect that these antibodies from the vaccine would result in infertility either. Another fear I've heard mentioned is the fear of forced vaccination. So whether the federal government will send someone into our communities to force us to receive COVID vaccines or mandate it at the federal level. I don't work for the government, so I don't know for certain, but I do think it's very unlikely that the federal government will make such a mandate. On the other hand, I think it's fairly likely that employers, schools, airlines, and possibly state governments may require vaccination, though that likely won't happen for a while because the vaccines are currently being used under emergency use authorization, and it's likely that any vaccine mandates that might occur would occur after the full FDA approval is in place. Regarding state mandates, there is precedent for that. In 1905, a pastor in Massachusetts was fined $5 for refusing a smallpox vaccine, and the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the right of the state of Massachusetts to administer that fine. The hope, of course, is that people will choose to get vaccinated based on evidence of vaccine safety and efficacy. But it is reasonably likely that we will see requirements for vaccination at some level at some point, just most likely not at the federal level. Another interesting myth is that Bill Gates promotes vaccines as a way to put microchips into people. So Bill Gates does support vaccine programs. I don't think we have any evidence to suggest that he spends his time or money putting microchips into people. Not only is that kind of logistically impossible to imagine, but he doesn't have to put microchips into people. We all willingly carry our chips around in our pockets wherever we go. In addition to hopes and fears, the COVID-19 vaccines and vaccination programs bring up a lot of questions. Who will get vaccinated? When? How? How will we know about long-term safety? Will we get to pick which vaccine we want? And most importantly, will the vaccine really end the pandemic? Here's a picture of one of the first people in the U.S. to receive a COVID-19 vaccine, Sandra Lindsay, an intensive care nurse in New York City. She was among those who received the first vaccine dose on December 14th. In the subsequent days, about 2 million Americans have received their first of 2 doses. Each state has its own plan for vaccine administration, and in most states, the plan is to start with those at highest risk of exposure, including medical personnel and residents of long-term care facilities, first. In Vermont, the Department of Health has created a stepwise approach based on CDC guidance, with a focus again on vaccinating those at highest risk of exposure first, before moving on to those with underlying medical conditions, and so on. The exact timeline is unclear, but to date, about 4,300 Vermonters have been vaccinated. A lot of people are wondering, do I need to be doing something? Do I need to sign up to get a vaccine? Currently, there is no signing up or scheduling to be done for the general public or even for those with underlying medical conditions. The Department of Health will make an announcement when enough doses are available for people to begin scheduling appointments to be vaccinated. So the only thing people really need to be doing is to pay attention to the local news to know when scheduling does become available for those with underlying conditions and then for the general public. We do know that vaccine administration will definitely occur by appointment only in order to ensure physical distancing for those receiving the vaccine and for those administering it. Long-term safety is, of course, a question that many people have. And I think it's really important to recall that once our body has created antibodies in response to the vaccine, those antibodies are just like any other antibodies that we have. There's no distinction. So the adverse events that do occur generally occur really within the first few days of getting a vaccine, but then certainly within the first month or so. And those adverse events are usually things like fever, site reaction, etc. So our immune system kind of kicking in to respond to the vaccine and developing antibodies. There have been a few instances of anaphylaxis in response to the vaccine, so many vaccine administration sites monitor people after their injections to be sure that no anaphylactic reactions occur, and of course to treat those reactions should they occur. It's probably wise for now for those with a prior history of anaphylactic reactions to vaccines to avoid receiving the COVID vaccine at this time. People with severe immunocompromise, like those who are on chemotherapy, may take longer to have adverse events because it takes their immune systems longer to kick in on receiving a vaccine. So their kind of acute or early response may actually happen 6 months later as opposed to 1 month later for those with a normal functioning immune system. So once our cells have made the spike proteins and our immune systems are making antibodies, the mRNA that's in the vaccine is broken down by enzymes. The spike proteins are broken down by enzymes, and the other vaccine ingredients are excreted or broken down such that they're just like other proteins, fats, and electrolytes that are already in our bodies, and again are indistinguishable from those proteins, fats, and electrolytes that are already there. The mRNA vaccines do not contain any preservatives or adjuvants. While there is no evidence that those ingredients are harmful, it just happens that these particular vaccine formulations do not require them. Another question that comes up is whether an individual will get to choose which vaccine to receive. And the answer is really no, unless you want to wait until all of the vaccines have been approved and until the initial phases of vaccination are over, which could be quite a while. Otherwise, the best bet is really to take whichever vaccine is available. The ones that already have emergency use authorization are both mRNA vaccines, and we discussed their rapid development and authorization earlier in this presentation. Other ones that are likely to be available relatively soon are kind of more traditional viral vector vaccines. And fortunately for all of us, these vaccines are all proving to be quite effective and safe. I think the biggest and most important question is, will the vaccine really end the pandemic? And the answer is yes, if enough people get vaccinated. It will take some time, so getting vaccinated or seeing pictures of other people getting vaccinated doesn't mean that the pandemic is over and that we should all fly across the country to kiss our grandmothers as much as we may want to. It will remain important to wear a mask, maintain physical distancing, avoid gatherings, all of those pandemic precautions for most of 2021. And if we hadn't learned it before, then certainly hopefully we know it now. that it will always be important to wash our hands. I hope that this has been helpful, and I'm sure that many people still have many questions. So if you're one of those people, be sure to check out the Vermont Department of Health website, where you could call 211 or reach out to your doctor's office. I will note that if your question is, when am I going to get the vaccine? Can I get the vaccine now? The best place to look is the Vermont Department of Health website or even the local news, because again, there will be announcements when people are able to go ahead and schedule their vaccine administration. The next slide includes resources that I used. Additionally, there's resources embedded in links throughout. Again, I hope this was helpful, and I hope that we all have a better 2021.